Watching News at Prime. It is a Thursday and time for our weekly Leadership Thursday feature. This week, we have the privilege of being joined by the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr Navi Pillay, and she's going to talk to us about her efforts to fight for human rights around the globe and to tell us about the work and indeed the developments, not just in our country, but globally as well. Dr. Pillay, it truly is a privilege to talk to you. Good evening to you and thank you for your time.
Good evening, colleague. Good evening to viewers. I'm very happy to be here on this program.
Well, let's kick off the conversation with your role, or should I say, the majority of your life. You have worked hard at fighting for human rights. And I want to start the conversation there. Looking at the world today, do you get a sense that human rights, or should we say the observance and respect for human rights, is somewhat regressing?
This always comes up when there's a down. There are ups and downs, and when there are downs, the last time that President Trump held office, he won the elections, you will not believe the number of universities in the United States who asked me to come and address their students because everyone was apparently so depressed that this is the end of human rights. And I say the struggle for human rights never ends, and so we all continue our efforts. So civil society does not see anything as a setback. They will continue to fight, and I gave these kind of positive messages to students that it's not going, a trajectory completely turning around and going completely down. No, it's ups and downs. It's for us, civil society and people all over the world, to collectively ensure that governments respect human rights.
I'm going to start here at home, Dr. Pillay. And so many people today are going hungry, and this is due to either poverty, the lack of jobs. And incidentally today, at the National Council of Provinces, the president, in his reply, he says that he is happy that people recognize that this stems from our past, our apartheid past, because people were starved of the privilege of getting an education. And 30 years on, is he correct to still blame apartheid for what the Premier of the Eastern Cape, for example, Oscar Mabuyane, today as well said there are even pockets where there is child malnutrition in his province? And how can that be in a country that does not suffer poverty at the moment in terms of food, just the access to food? It is something that it is thrown away almost on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. I would say, colleague, that countries that were formerly colonized, that's the whole of Africa, but there are other parts of the world as well, are justified in looking at the ravages of capitalism and colonialism on our countries that left us impoverished. So that would be an explanation about why we haven't caught up. But to focus on our country, we all know that we have plenty of resources. We have a manageable population. We don't have a population of 1 billion. It's just 55 million, still counting. So it's a manageable situation. And we have had 30 years. The new democratic government was led by former freedom fighters. And they, of all people, should have come in with the urge to deliver on their election promises and their entire struggle for liberation. the time came to deliver on those. So that is what should have been prioritized, the economic and social rights. Instead, like very many governments and businesses all over the world, we find that the poor have become poorer in South Africa, the rich very much so. The politicians paid the first attention to themselves. They needed better housing in Pretoria and Cape Town. There's very, very many things that the public point to, which is wastage and corruption. So I would agree that there is much justification to demand that our government change its path. You know, we can't do much about the failures of the last 30 years, but they can do so now by delivering on the priorities. Our country, our people should not be without water. We shouldn't be having pit latrines in this day and age. And the priority should have been to deliver to those who were most disadvantaged under the apartheid system, under the colonial system, instead of protecting and prioritizing the rights of the poor, the human rights of the poor, we've tended to neglect that. And I still hear of people talking about, of course, we need businesses. They are the ones that create jobs, but a fair distribution. I spent a lot of time when I was High Commissioner on the Action Plan for Development, which is called Agenda 2030. It's halfway through now, 2030, we're in 2024. And there is very likelihood that those minimum goals will be delivered by countries.
Yeah.
So the human rights people brought in the human rights language into the development agenda, into the health agenda, to say you cannot leave anyone behind. You have to look after the rights of everyone.
Yeah. You've spoken about the governance failures, which lead to, among other issues, poverty. Do you believe that these governance failures amount to human rights violations in South Africa?
Well, I'd like to hear the explanations. They may have explanations that I don't know about why this hasn't been done. The public is asking questions about many of the state-owned enterprises. I saw some figures. Except for one or two, none of them are functioning properly. So we need more openness and trust from the government. I would say governments should trust their civil society. They should trust their voters, share information, and share with us what are the obstacles and challenges. Having said that, let me say that not only me, but all the high commissioners who served before me and those who came after me have unanimously said that it is governments who violate the human rights treaties more than anyone else. The duty of delivering is on governments. They've undertaken obligations to look after the poor. So we lay the blame squarely on the authorities who have the power to deliver and who have undertaken obligations in the international fora to uplift their people's economic and social rights, their health right to food, as you mentioned, right to water.
Yeah. I want to actually use exactly what you've just said to segue into the globe now. South Africa has played a major role in what is going on in the Middle East. And when I say played a major role, we saw them go to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to argue that Israel is committing a genocide against the people of Gaza. But before we talk about that, do you believe that South Africa has done enough in its own backyard to observe the very human rights that they have highlighted are being violated by Israel in Gaza?
So before we look at the international role, you want me to observe the national role. I would say that our governments have tried. We have a good constitution. It safeguards our rights to freedom of speech, the right of assembly in many countries in Africa and elsewhere. Palestinian protesters were fired upon in Germany, for instance. Some terrible things that are happening in developed countries with regard to the protection of human rights will never happen here because the government is committed to deliver on the Constitution, and we have the safeguards of an independent judiciary, a very vibrant civil society, and an alert media. So we've got all the mechanisms in place. What we want to see is that our government becomes more accountable to deliver on its obligations.
Let's talk about the Middle East conflict. What is your assessment of the current human rights situation in the Israel-Gaza conflict?
Well, first, Xoli, I'm sure you and viewers know that my current position is that I hold the chair of the United Nations Commission, which is a permanent commission to investigate and look into the root causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And more recently, we have additional mandates to prepare reports, to investigate and prepare reports on the transfer of military equipment from other states to Israel. We are also authorized to look at violence on the part of settlers. So anyway, this is the commission, and presently I chair this commission together with Chris Sidoti from Australia. He was the chair of their Human Rights Commission, and a team of about 14 or 18 people. But we work very closely with the entire United Nations. We have delivered 5 reports so far. One of our reports was before the General Assembly in October 22, where we identified the root cause of the conflict as the occupation itself. And we said, based on all this factual evidence that we've gathered, and which is in our report, based on the examination of the international law, the root cause of the conflict is the occupation. It's unlawful and it must end. And that the General Assembly then adopted our recommendation, and I was very happy to see the large majority then pass a resolution. It's now history. The International Court of Justice, soon after it had delivered the provisional orders measures that South Africa successfully sought, soon after that, the ICJ delivered its opinion, its legal opinion to member states to say that the occupation is unlawful and must be brought to an end rapidly.
Yeah.
The settlements must be dismantled. Reparations must be made to Palestinians. Well, I think everybody knows this ruling. And in earlier this year, in September, a majority of the member states of the General Assembly, I think 124 states, approved the implementation of that order.
Yeah.
So I would say the whole world is horrified by what is happening, and governments have expressed themselves that there must be a ceasefire. But Israel is being supported by a few states, among them United States in particular, the United Kingdom, as well as Germany, France, and other countries who have been helping Israel militarily, financially, morally, and just, in my view, indulging in all kinds of double standards in the application of international law. And that's how the situation is going on there. But on a point of how I see things now, Xoli, for the very first time, international law is uppermost, not the rule of force, but the rule of law. And so complemented by South Africa's complaint under the Genocide Convention, I see that, and of course the ICC arrest warrants, I see things now coming together as never before in response to the violent retaliation that Israel, together with its friends, has launched against the Palestinians.
Do you genuinely believe that Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister, and let's include in there Hamas, will and could genuinely be held accountable for what has happened?
Remember that under apartheid, we had terrible laws suppressing us, but we had no remedies. There was no international forum we can appeal to. There was no international court. Of course, we appealed to the United Nations. At first, Margaret Thatcher of the UK and Ronald Reagan of the US opposed sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And much later, they were persuaded by the power of civil societies to change that, and then they impose sanctions. So I've seen struggles like this. That's why I'm very hopeful that always calling for the unbiased application of international law will provide remedies. They helped us in South Africa, and hopefully they will help the people of Palestine.
Well, let's take a break, because when we return, I'd like to ask you about the role of the United Nations. Some are worried that it is possibly going to diminish, particularly with the return of President Trump. You're watching News at Prime. The segment of the show is called Leadership Thursday, and we are in conversation with Dr. Navi Pillay. Dr. Pillay, let's talk about the United Nations, the role of the United Nations. There are some who worry that this institution its role is fast diminishing. There are those who say on the matter of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the United Nations has not been strong enough. When it comes to the Middle East conflict, you will often hear the Israeli ambassador to the UN criticizing it to a point where they've even barred the UN Secretary General from going to Israel. Do you worry about the role of the UN as a global body?
Xoli, we all must invest in multilateralism. We have to have a set of rules that's international law that is agreed upon by all states. And we have that. We've achieved that. I would say the United Nations is an imperfect institution, mainly because 5 big powers, we call them the P5, United States, UK, France, Russia and China have the veto power, and that means they could always hide behind the veto for themselves and their friends. So it's an imperfect institution, but it's the best we have. And in times of crisis like we have now in the Middle East, I see the states coming together with 124 states who passed a resolution supporting the advisory opinion of the ICJ, and very many of them supporting South Africa's complaint of genocide. So you will always get differences because states will act out of their national interest or their regional interest or their group interests. It shouldn't be. This is why we have high commissioners for human rights. This is why we have civil society saying you cannot practice human rights selectively. You cannot have double standards, one for your friends and one for your foes.
Yeah.
You have to have the same standards for everyone. So therefore, we need this institution and we have to make it work. Often we ask ourselves, so who is the United Nations? Is it, so the members are member states. Governments form the United Nations, not you and I, not the media, not civil society. We don't have a place there. And actually, I could give you a long account where there has been great progress in protection of people's rights protection of human rights, and now the environment, the push comes from civil society. So it's not that these governments sit there in these halls and decide, oh, we must do a better job of protecting human rights of all civilians. So it's a combination of roles, and this is why civil society must continue to collectively pressure this body, the United Nations, and all the governments there to deliver on all the obligations they have undertaken, even on the environment. They've just been through COP conference, and all the obligations towards developing countries. It's been well documented, the Durban Declaration on Racism, also documented, for instance, the ravages that colonization left in Africa, and therefore they have an obligation to provide us with assistance to catch up with them economically. So here are the standards. It's good that we have these important standards. It's like having a good constitution and laws like South Africa has. That's a good thing. How to get politicians to act in the interests of people. Yeah, I agree with you. So that's the challenge. But there are many mechanisms now, apart from the High Commissioner. You have heads of various units, including peacekeeping, including UNRWA, who provided humanitarian aid and is now struggling in Palestine. And about 60 special rapporteurs who are independent experts. 3 or 4 of them come from South Africa. And of course, there are these commissions of inquiry, such as this commission on Israel and Palestine that I serve on. We have a relationship agreement with the International Criminal Court, because the United Nations and the ICC have this agreement. And under that agreement, we share, at the request of the prosecutor, all the factual evidence that we are finding. And similarly, we all cooperate with one another. Now, our commission is investigating, even though Israel is not allowing us to enter Israel and talk to victims. But the information is pouring out of Israel from very many people who support the rights of Palestinians, their right of self-determination. And from experts and academics all over the world. And that's what keeps me positive. But from my end, I can see so much support and activity across. The majority of the world supports Palestinians' justified claim for liberation from occupation.
Dr. Pillay, it would be remiss of me to not also highlight the fact that there are wars on the continent of Africa as well, and with the threats to cut funding for the UN, President Trump returns to the White House in January, and he has long made the promise that he is going to cut funding. In his first term of office, he had started cutting funding to certain UN agencies. In Sudan, they announced that they received less than half of the aid that they had been promised. Is that a worry in terms of the UN's muscle to help, particularly in areas of conflict, that the cuts to its funding is soon going to be a problem?
Polly, you are right. It's a matter of grave concern, because in many of these conflict situations, people are starving and they need protection mainly. And only the UN can provide humanitarian aid and protection and send in peacekeeping troops. The one comforting point is that there are all the other states who said they will step in if the US cuts funding to the United Nations. I would like to say one thing about the United States. The United States always supported the rule of law and international law. It was the US who took the initiative in the Security Council to set up the ad hoc tribunals for former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda to deal with to deliver justice against the genocidaires in Rwanda, on which I served as judge, as you will know. So they have a long history of supporting the United Nations. They are the biggest funder, irrespective of which president was presiding over the US administration. So I'm hoping that they will adhere to their principled position of support for a multilateral institution.
Yeah.
If there's a cut in funding under the incoming regime, I hope that would be temporary. And I hope that the rest of the world, the states I mean, will step in and fill that gap.
Final question to you, Dr. Pillay. And we end this conversation on the home front. As someone who experienced racism firsthand, that history is documented about why perhaps it is that you decided to take the route that you did in terms of your discipline. How important is it that apartheid-era crimes are pursued and pursued successfully in South Africa?
Xoli, who are you and me to tell the victims of apartheid to drop their claims? They know their suffering and what they're going through, and they have a right to reparation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission promised a full investigation, and it hasn't happened. So I'm fully in support of all those communities who are persisting with their claims, A, for accountability, B, for justice, and C, for reparation. I think those are legitimate claims. We cannot drop them as long as they have not been fulfilled.
Dr. Navi Pillay, I want to thank you very much for your time and indeed your insight to some of the intractable issues, not just in South Africa, but the world over. Thanks indeed for your time. This has been our Leadership Thursday.